Yes, welcome to this session on the value-based approach to cultural policy. We have already heard quite a bit about culture policy in this conference. There's a great presentation of David Throsby covering basically all the contributions that we economists have made to the discussion on culture policy. We also got a nice session of Eleanor Belvoir ending up with a plea for for care, the ethics of care, which I thought was an interesting sort of input, something to think about. And of course, we have seen all kinds of other presentations about research into culture policy in South America. So it's a topic very much on our mind, apparently, in this conference. In this panel, we would like to see what a value-based approach to cultural economics could bring to the discussion of cultural policy. And to that, we have here Bronwyn Coat, well known to all of you, who sort of gives a perspective focusing on cultural values. Mignosa, the expert on cultural heritage and also craft. And she will give also her insights and experiences that she has, among others, in Sicily with new approaches to cultural policy. Valeria Morea was currently in Venice, and she did an interesting study on public arts, which is, of course, a form of cultural policy. And she has some interesting insights into what makes public art work. And it's very nice also to have David Throsby be part of it, because we are very curious for the way he responds to what we are going to bring in. I will kick off, and as always, I had a very, is this clear so? Do you see on the screen my presentation?
Yes, Arjo, but maybe you can make more like just a presentation, one slide.
Yeah, so this way.
We see both the main slides, but also all the other slides, and there should be the presentation mode. This, I think, it's a presenter mode.
Okay. Well, this is not what I'm very good at. Well, let me go ahead. So we focus on what we call a value-based approach. And the idea is that it takes us beyond the standard economic approach that we also familiar with, but that in sort of common parlor is sometimes known as the neoliberal policy, as it seems to focus on what we call transactions, that we economists are inclined to think in terms of transactions. And that the major motivation for culture policy is market failure. Transactions not taking place, that could be because of the public good character of art, or the merit good character and a lack of demand. We all know this. And also the traditional frame that we put it in is the frame of production, distribution and consumption. That's all too familiar. Now, I have myself and some of you also some experience in actual policy. I've been in a local setting, a governor for a while. I have been part of an arts council, and also a few of my students, in particular Dorothea Kiss, have done research on the impact of cultural economics. And especially Dorothea found out, to her great disappointment, that many policymakers, civil servants, had no idea what cultural economics had contributed. Contingent valuation didn't seem to make a great deal of sense. Merit, good arguments, maybe. economic impact studies that they were interested in. So apparently there we made a difference. And of course, the notion of culture entrepreneurship. They also ran with that. But a lot of the research that we do seem to go by them. But at the same time, we've seen what we would call now neoliberal policies, but the tendency to focus on privatization, on sponsoring, having the market generating the finances. Now, it seems that that phase is passing. Although Florida is still on the table, tourism is still being considered to be an important reason to subsidize culture and cultural heritage. The shift is towards public values, towards social impact. At least that's the buzz right now. At least I speak for most, I think also Australia, but European countries, it's all about public values, inclusion, diversity, and so on. And what we see is a great need for a qualitative evaluation to understand how well we or they are doing. It seems that we are sort of desperately, all these organizations, foundations are looking for a new method. And what I see is also an interest in what I call then a sense of purpose. What is it good for? And that's also what leadership is all about. Now, this is the picture in the value-based approach that we focus on. You see the two logics that we usually focus on is the logic of the market, and then to the right, the logic of governance, or logic of organizations, of governments, that we know all about. But the value-based approach brings in three other logics. One is the logic of the oikos, the home, the personal sphere, family life, the life that people live for themselves on their own. The social sphere, close to home, friendships, communities, further away, societies, the world. And then hovering over all is what I call the cultural sphere or the sense-making sphere. That's where we are right now. We are now trying to make sense of culture policy and a value-based approach. And so we are in that sphere. And actually that sphere, and that comprises scientific discussions, but also artistic practices and the ones we are talking about. Now, if you focus on the M and the G, then you get sort of the standard consumption, distribution, and consumption mainly taking place in the M. The governmental sphere, we economists have more difficulties with that. Of course, we also try to sort of draw it into the transaction sphere, and of course then we try to think about public goods, externalities, and property rights. That all fits very well in these two logic of the M and the G. But of course, what the value-based approach is to extend that perspective. I hope that you can read this, but it's really another perspective. The starting point of the value-based approach is just start with you and me, with people seeking a good life. That's true for everyone. Poor, rich, everyone tries to realize something that's important to them. That's the value-based approach. What are the values that are important to you? Now, for many people, it is their family life, friendships, being part of a community, justice, sustainable environments, and most important also that what you could call sense-making activities. It could be religious, but also artistic. Think of music, dance, things that give you inspiration. That all makes up a good life. Now, the big concept that, at least that we are trying to get in, all these people working on the value-based approach, is to think not in terms of products, but in terms of practices. So you don't buy a painting, or you don't go to visit a performance, you are taking part in a practice. And art is a practice, so is this. Cultural economics is also a practice that you and I contribute in and participate in. And we do so because apparently that's important to us. And the same applies to people who dance, who attend dancing performances, who play music, attend music performances. Because we all in some way or another participate and contribute to the practice. Art is, of course, by making art, therefore contribute and work to the practice, but also those who are entering it and participate in, to enjoy it, to be active, to listen, to pay attention, to talk about it. That is all a matter of participating and contributing. So art, and that is true for other activities too, like science, religion, is a shared practice. You want to share it with others, usually. And so we think that it helps to step away from the production and consumption concepts, but think more in terms of participation and contribution. So we are participants and contributors. And so the transactions involved are only sort of subsidiary. They facilitate and support. Of course, they're necessary, a necessary part, but not the essential part. The essential part is in the practice. Now, then you can ask to what extent markets and organizations, but also governments, enable people to realize a good life and facilitate and contribute to common practices. What can these sort of instruments add to these practices to make them possible, to facilitate them? Now, if we look at the world from that perspective, then what is a real interest are the qualities of the common practices. How well is it going in my own town? Is there something like a dance practice or a music practice or a theater practice? Not very much actually in my own town, but there's a lot of music going on in my town. Lots of musicians. So it has a rich musical practice. As a government, you can then think about maybe that you want to stimulate other practices to enrich life in a city or in a country. And that might be motivating the culture policy. So here are some important points, is that it needs to have a purpose. You need to know what it is good for. And in the end, of course, it is about enabling people to live a good life. And so you have to have an understanding of what constitutes a good life. Is art part of that? What kind of arts are part of that? In my hometown, a professional theater group is not what is really needed, but more amateur theater groups would be really good for a more qualitative common practice. So the same is culture heritage. Anna will refer to that as a common practice, so that people are involved, that it is just standing there or laying somewhere for people who to look it up. No, that is part of daily practice. It constitutes part of what we call a good society, a good life. That it adds meaning to life. That is what it seems to be all about. So that comes to some notions of what could be innovative cultural policies. And that you think about the government not as a subsidizer, but as a partner in these practices. That a government can facilitate and can support and strengthen certain common practices. You can also, I myself am a favor cooperatives, have been involved in setting up a few cooperatives in which the government is also a member, next to all kinds of other members. So there is the government represents the community, the communal interest, make sure, for example, that the organization is inclusive, that there is enough diversity and things like that. You can integrate artistic practices in educational institutions. You can create free zones where artists can go around without being restricted by regulations. You can think of innovative financial schemes, culture shares in performances, gifts, donations, and participation. Instead of sponsors, having people of organizations contribute, and adoption of artists by organization that we have heard before, I think. But these are all intended to increase the participation and contribution in common practices that are the arts. Now, finally, my final point is that all needs a qualitative evaluation that calls for a quality evaluator. And in the conference, we have a paper by Petrova and others, and also a session of Alan Loads later on that is about this. Now, that is what I would like to say about the value-based approach. And I would like to invite Anna Mignosa, because you have also some ideas to contribute to this discussion. So please share that with us.
Thank you, Arjo. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this session, because of course it's a great opportunity to think about what we've been doing in, well, for some years now, I must say. And in fact, I think that what is interesting in our conversation today is the idea of looking at cultural policy with a very, I don't know if it a specific lens, which somehow I think put together what Eleonora said yesterday, what David was suggesting, but also somehow answers some instances, some things that seems to be out there when we look at what is happening with culture, what people are doing with culture. And so if from one point of view, you know, the culture policy part, I see these changes that you were mentioning. I agree with you that it was very much related to the new public management and then new public governance, when it was everything about value for money. What I think happened is that led to a change in the organization, so a reduction in the role of the state. First of all, the decentralization, so decision would be taken more at the local level, which in principle, according to economics, that leads to choices which are closer to what people really need, really want. And on the other side, also reduction of the role of the state. And that is very interesting, because if on at the beginning it was very much about, you know, the private intervention, more economic, what I think is happening now, what I see is happening now, is that it is opening a lot to communities, to non-profit organization. And I think this is the shift which I would like to point at. I agree with you that before going there, I think it's important to say, to underline also that there's been a shift, and it's not anymore only value for money, but there are a lot of attempts to try to see what is the culture and social impact of culture. And I think that is also a very interesting shift. We saw it in the measure of well-being of countries, so with the idea of going beyond GDP, but this has translated, when we look at the way of working of culture organization, in an attempt to try to determine what is that they're doing. Is it worthwhile to keep a museum when there are hundreds of visitors per year? Maybe yes, because this is something that gives people a sense of identity. And so you see that this idea of the common practice, this idea of the shared heritage, is something that counterbalance what economically is sometimes absolutely not feasible. So again, I think that the value-based approach provide a particular lens, an interesting lens, to look at culture as a shared practice. I'm involved in a European project at the moment about culture heritage. And what is interesting is that after a lot of talk, we decided that the only possible starting point, and I'm working with conservator, curator, was to think of heritage as something which is a shared practice, a common practice, because otherwise, you know, we would have gone in all direction. I'm the culture economist, so, you know, we don't like her, but, you know, it was very important, and that provided us a very strong common ground. And the conversation now is proceeding in a very challenging way, but very, I would say, constructive. And so I go to my previous point. What I'm seeing and what I'm analyzing, but I also directly testified, is that I see a multiplication of bottom-up initiatives taking care of culture, taking care of culture heritage. I come from Italy. We like to say that we have the highest quantity of culture heritage. Nobody knows. I mean, this is something we cannot state because we don't have a real measure. We have more word culture heritage, but we don't know when it comes to the national level because it's quite complicated. But what is very, very interesting is that you see all over Italy a lot of initiatives where communities, non-profit organizations take care of their heritage. So this is the shift which I find also very interesting, the idea of their heritage, which is a rhetoric which has been, for instance, in the UK already from the 90s. So they talk about our heritage as something which is shared among the population, but also who's taking care of heritage. So this shift, I think it's a sort of word, but I think it's very important because it shows a shift in the way of looking at heritage, of conceiving heritage. And I think it's also a way to, reduce the separation that has often been there. You mentioned it, why should we subsidize heritage? Because sometimes in the past, what was the problem is that only the wealthier, the most educated would attend heritage would go to museum or attend opera. But if we have this shift, thinking about the common practices, maybe this is something that would really make a change, talking about our culture. Our culture. And I see two different aspects in this. One is practical. So for instance, when we go to culture policy, the reduction of the role of the state, you have a lot of public-private partnership taking place. UNESCO also underlined the importance of this tool. We have to watch out because sometimes it's a way to, to mask what is actually just contracting out. So again, the very strong market logic. But in many instances, you have very much this idea of public-private partnership. I was mentioning, I testified, I follow actually the implementation of an example with a World Heritage site in my hometown. It's a university place, but it's also a World Heritage site. It used to be a monastery, now it's a university. But what has happened is really like the idea of opening it up, not only to, people from academia, but also to the population in town. And I'm happy because it became the second most visited and most known place in the whole province after the Etna, the volcano. So, it's quite like happy result. But apart, so we need tools. So you were mentioning the role of the state, of the government as a facilitator is fundamental. And the main problem there is that sometimes these rules are not clear. There's not enough transparency. You really need to have a shared vision. You need to accept that maybe the small remain of the walls that nobody cares about, but this small community cares about, is something to pay attention to. So it requires also really like a shift in the way of dealing with culture in general. And these I see, in the Netherlands, I see in Italy. Unfortunately, sometimes who decides are still a very elitarian vision. But if we shift to this common practice idea, it's also a matter of letting really people say, well, I like this kind of music, like in my hometown, it's really like, no. But if people like it, well, it's a shared practice again. And maybe, they start with the one form of music, but we know that, you can also then vary your, let's say, a basket of preferences. So I think that is a very important aspect. So the government still has an important role, but it's a different role. It's more like a facilitator. And for this to happen, I said rules are important, but I think what is also important, and this is something I relate to what has been said in the previous session, data. Data needs to be very, I think we need a change in that, because often we look at data that represent only like a tiny fraction of what the culture sector is. And I think this was one of the main problems that we had through the pandemic, because we know that a lot of people were left out from all the measures that were taken. And definitely, I think that Eleonora's suggestion yesterday to bring together more disciplines and have a common ground is fundamental. But I think it is fundamental if we bring in also the policymaker, because one of the questions yesterday was like, why are culture economists not listened? Well, but we do not really listen policymaker, and vice versa. And the few instances when I really was with policymaker, on one side they can be irritating for us because we say, okay, 1, 2, 3, it's very clear. But once we did an exercise, like a policy exercise, it's a nightmare. It's absolutely a nightmare, with all the rules and the procedure, all our clear-cut classification, etc., are impossible to be applied. So we really need to have a common ground and a lot of exchange of ideas to make a change. So I think this would be an important shift. So I think the value-based approach, somehow frame it differently, frame it in a way that, I don't know, what is a traditional idea, economic concept like private provision of public good is just framed within the value-based approach, maybe more into a more giftish approach, but that's a clear, a typical economic concept that has a very different shift. You know, it requires different mind shift. So this idea of common shared practice contribute to something which is really like belongs to the community. So I think that's what I would like to say. Thank you.
It's wonderful what you said. I mean, because the last point that you made about the mind shift is important, I think, because I do think it involves a mind shift. And what I also think is important in what you said is, how do you make cultural heritage our heritage, or that it is that we appropriate, the people appropriate it. You give an example in your own hometown, Catania, with the monastery that succeeded in that, to create now sort of a sense of us. And for that, you also emphasize the importance of private-public partnership. That also connects with this notion of a cooperative, that you in some way or another share the responsibility, and that's also what you focus very much on, that it becomes shared practice, common practice, and the role of the government as a facilitator. Maybe in later we can develop that a little bit more because of what you said, and also what I also hear, but I know you of course better, is that you want to democratize. You also mentioned in our talk before that you like this term in the previous session of decolonization. That's right? That you want to sort of bring other people in. But that's implied in this common practice idea, you know, Anna?
Absolutely, absolutely. I liked in the previous session, you know, it was about Australia. So there was this idea of decolonization. But somehow, even if I live in Europe, and, you know, Italy is probably one of the less multicultural country. I mean, if I compare to the Netherlands, for instance, but I think there's a different way, you know, of colonization culture, which is more like, you know, it's very old fashioned, I know, but like high culture, low culture, you know, this idea of an elite that decides, it's a form of colonization, I think. So we can call it decolonization, democratization, but that's the idea, definitely.
All right. So let me bring in Bronwyn. Bronwyn, it is unbelievable that you are able to partake in this session, knowing how incredibly busy you are. I bow my head deeply for all the work you have been doing and responding to all our emails. I mean, must be unbelievable. I know how busy it gets to be in a conference, but very nice that you can participate in this discussion. And Anna was talking about this change of mindset. Is that what you experience? I mean, you do work on cultural value, and so what do you would like to sort of make as a point to our discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to share some slides, so just bear with me for a sec.
By the way, what she's doing, please answer, bring in your questions, because after David has given his comments, we will hope to be able to respond to issues that you bring in and questions that you have. But go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well,
survey of all your files. That is not.
Oh, no, sorry. Oh gosh.
Yeah, you know the problem.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, there we are.
And sorry, I'll go away. What's this doing? I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
No. Oh, look, maybe we just won't worry about the presentation, as I'm eating into time. And
I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Okay.
And put it full screen on the bottom. Then
yeah.
If you click that away. And click that away. And then go full screen on the bottom. Yeah, so there you are, more or less.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so I'd just like to thank Arjo, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this panel that will unpack what we mean by cultural value and address why it's important, which obviously is a big theme and something that we're touching upon with the conference. And it's important, I think, with cultural value that we remember that it's important to value culture in its own terms and for its own reasons, distinct from economic and social value as well. And certainly cultural value is a perennial theme that emerges in our field of cultural economics. And it's one that, in order to fully understand and appreciate, we as cultural economists can benefit from acknowledging the insights and contributions from other disciplines. And certainly this has been a point that's been convincingly made, has already been mentioned by Anna, but certainly in the keynote that paired a noted cultural economist in David with a noted cultural policy specialist in Ali, we really had good evidence of that the benefits that can come from combining different perspectives to address the common challenges that we face in unpacking what we actually sort of mean by cultural value, why it's important. Okay, so in my presentation, I'm going to talk about why culture matters in its own right and why we should avoid confounding cultural value with economic value and social value. And to illustrate this, I'm going to be drawing on the case of valuing Indigenous culture and intangible cultural heritage. And at this point, as a symbolic protocol and to convey respect of First Nations people, and with relevance to my presentation as well, I might add, I want to express my respect to Indigenous and First Nations people. I want to acknowledge that despite the fact that we are experiencing this panel online rather than in person, at this moment I am physically located on the beautiful ancient lands of the Kuliyong people, located in southeastern Australia, along the coast of the Australian mainland. It's about 2 hours from Melbourne, where we had our last ACEI conference. And I pay my respects to the First Nations people around Australia and also globally, and want to warmly welcome any First Nations people who are watching this presentation. And I just also want to add that across Australia, sovereignty has never ceded as well. Okay, so throughout my presentation, I'm going to be featuring some pictures that I've taken over the last weekend, actually, when I was out mountain biking with my 2 children, because it's school holidays here at the moment. So another element of being busy is keeping kids entertained as well. But we were enjoying the outdoors and everything. So I've just got some pictures showing the traditional lands of the Kuliyong people in my presentation. Okay, so as a starting point, I'd like to pose the question that came up yesterday: why does culture matter? Surely answering this lies at the heart of being able to provide a rationale and argument to support a well-designed cultural policy. But as we know, while it sounds obvious to say that culture matters, when it comes to articulating why that's the case, things start to get very murky. What counts as culture for some is not the same for others. This is not simply about the distinction between high and low culture that Anna mentioned, but it's also more deeply rooted and linked to social behaviour and norms that shape our values, that shape our beliefs and our sense of identity and belonging. As something that is so deeply human, it is perhaps not surprising that so many definitions and ways in which we can see culture manifest exist. Culture can be expressed in paintings, it can be expressed in dance, craft, literature, folklore, language, customs and food. The list goes on and on. Okay, so there are many different ways in which we can think of culture, and what I've just mentioned just really scratches the surface there. If you were to Google what culture means, online, and you go to Wikipedia, and you'd see that culture is a term that describes an umbrella term which encompasses the social behaviour and norms found in human societies, as well as the knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities and habits of the individuals within these groups. Okay, so in this respect, culture resides and manifests in a variety of ways that take on different meanings and different significance to different people, both individually and also collectively. And this lies at the heart of culture wars, for instance. And it's also why in Australia, cultural cringe has been a phenomenon that has persisted for so long as well. So with these points in mind, let me now return to highlight what we can learn or how we can benefit from valuing Indigenous culture. Australia is often thought of a nation with a relatively short history. Indeed, in our national anthem, the mistaken claim is made that we are young and free. Okay, but our Indigenous Australia shows that we are home to the oldest continuing culture in the world. Indigenous practices have continued for over 60,000 years, so we're hardly young. And importantly, the contributions of Indigenous communities around Australia make a vibrant living culture that continues rather than one that is ancient, lost in time, and a mere ethnographic curiosity. In statistics on participation and contribution to the arts, Indigenous Australians are overrepresented. They're also overrepresented in statistics that have a negative connotation, indicators of juvenile delinquency, incarceration, poor literacy rates, lower life expectancy, and so on. Okay, but yet in the arts and culture, they are certainly overrepresented. Okay, and I dare say that if I was to ask participants here, especially those who aren't from Australia, about the art and culture of Australia, the most familiar that often comes to mind would quite likely be linked with our talented Indigenous artists and the contributions that they make. Okay, so Indigenous culture has also been linked at policy that is aimed to address some of the entrenched economic socioeconomic disadvantage faced by Indigenous communities as a means to facilitate improvements in their living standards. So that's been, from a government perspective, I guess, a confound of taking, culture and trying to use it as a way to advance socioeconomic objectives. But in its own right, Indigenous culture has also played a vital role in paving the path in mainstream Australia towards reconciliation and also towards advancement towards a treaty as well. But while the economic and social aspects that stem from Indigenous culture are important, they neglect the real benefit that our society enjoys from feeling connected to Indigenous culture. Stories of Bunjil as the totem wedge-tailed eagle that centres on the dreaming of many of the Indigenous communities around southeastern Australia take on meaning widely, and there's something that is reflected in school curriculum. My son comes home to share that with me, so that's something quite special. Okay, so seeing a wedge-tailed eagle fly in the sky is this nice connection with the local environment as well. That is something that is transmitted from the Indigenous custodians that everyone gets to appreciate once that becomes shared. So Indigenous culture offers to share with those that visit and occupy their lands this wonderful sense of connection, which is at the heart of culture. And I think that's probably enough from me for now. There's many other interesting people yet to speak, so I'll leave it there. Oh, I forgot to show more of my slides, so just quickly whiz through some of them. Some beautiful wildflowers and a grass street. Yeah, sorry.
I've been looking, Bronwyn, to the picture of the trees and the light, which has a sort of sense of the mystery, but also the sacred. That's the first picture that you showed. And what you stress is the importance of cultural values, and to make clear that we distinguish them from social and economic values. I think that, and what you also tell us that you haven't used the word, but it's important to be aware of these cultural values. I'm reminded here of Clifford Geertz, who defined us people as animals suspended in webs of significance that we spun ourselves. And that's what I think also you're referring to. The indigenous people have that web of significance. And in a way, you say it's important to have an appreciation of that, just like you have an appreciation of your own web of significance. That culture also calls for an awareness, and that's a practice, as we said, that also governments can facilitate, as Anna suggested, and support. And you, at the end, also talk about how important the role of education is. That your son is also aware of the cultural values that he way, and also can add to his web of significance. So that's in a way what I understand your plea for, right? Is that right?
Yes, yes, exactly right. That it's something that that is able to be shared, and it takes on meaning just beyond, you know, for Indigenous communities, that more broadly through, you know, big learning and you know, being able to share in the culture, that it enriches more broadly, and as a consequence of that, it also, you know, facilitates advancement towards you know, certain more social objectives rather than purely cultural ones, such as advancement towards a treaty, which is something that, you know, there's starting to be the mood and steps towards that. We're still, you know, quite a way, but that will be certainly a significant, you know, when that is achieved. Yeah.
I'm very curious how David is going to respond to your account. I know that he's also involved in indigenous culture, but this stress on cultural value as part of culture policy, and that I think is under valued so far, because we tend to focus, economists, on the economic outcomes, but you make a plea, and Anna in a way also, for that cultural policy is really about culture. And
yes.
Let me turn then to Valeria, right? You take now the discussion to public art, I expect. So what is your point, and what do you want to contribute to this discussion?
Sure. Good morning for the Europeans one. Good afternoon for the others. Thank you so much for having me. I guess I'm sharing a little presentation today. I would like to bring in this beautiful conversation, hopefully contribute to it with some insights from my research about the relationship between art and the city. Let me just tell you that, well, my name is Valeria Morea, and I am based in Venice as a postdoctoral researcher at UAV University. I would like to briefly make 2 points, hopefully conducive to a third one today, based on what I have been researching so far. As Arjo already anticipated, my doctoral research was about art in public space. I have explored and investigated mainly 4 cases of public art in middle to large European cities. And I have done quite some empirical investigation in understanding how it works. Also asking what is the value of it in the attempt to answer a bigger question about how public space at large works. So I have used public art to study public space, and with some observations of the space, drawing from architecture and urban planning too. I have investigated, here is one of my 4 cases. This one is in Copenhagen. It is a public sculpture that was actually a very bottom-up initiatives from 2 artists, originally from the Virgin Islands that used to be a colony of the Denmark Empire. So I think this could be a nice link for Anna and as well for Bronwyn. The problem here is that they couldn't really get public support. So they were lacking public policy, cultural policy in a way. and I have done some observations of how the space works around the sculpture and what do people do and how do we interact with the arts. So at large to see how it works, what is the life of that public art. Here is a second of the 4 cases. This is Barcelona, where I have investigated a statue from an artist originally from Barcelona, yet a very famous one. The statue was meant to be temporary, but then the people, the residents in the neighborhood, which happens to be very central in the very touristic city, they acted in a way with some petitions online to make the statue become permanent. So you see that in terms of how the statue works, in this case, it really enabled a lively atmosphere of the space, very physical space in this case. So my first point here is that refers to how we can in the way we can look at public art to understand a bit better how it works, and so in general how this type of, or how the cultural sector or some types of cultural sector work. What I have found out is that public art works not just because it is an artwork put somewhere public where everybody can pass by. It works based on the cultural practices that go on, which are shared. And more in particular, I have understood that the way public art works and the way it is meaningful to people, and then and thus it also is important to be fostered also in terms of public of cultural policy. It is because, well, it is a bit special. It evades the binary logic, the traditional logic of public versus private goods. It is not about a matter of producing it and consuming it. It is a matter of how all the interactions among people around it and also over time that can change it work. So it is not just a provision in terms of based on the merit good argument. We should go beyond it. And I have made this point also recently in a book I have worked on and edited named Cultural Commons and Urban Dynamics. Because in fact, thank you, Arjo, because what works here with public art is these happenings of cultural shared practices that really work based on the interdependency of all these relations that even made me argue well, maybe we should look at the functioning of public space and public art in specific as a potential relational commons. So a common resource, yet with little institutionalizations processes, but in between the urban and the cultural commons. This was my PhD argument in a way. Let me just give you a very brief insight on what I'm instead doing at the moment in Venice. So my second point for today, I am working on still exploring the relationship between arts and the city, but I am now looking at grassroots artistic organizations, so collectives of artists, small organizations, bottom-up activities, informal artistic practices. And based on a mapping that I've done, thematic analysis and a bunch of interviews, still very in the making, I am discovering that sometimes these collective actions, as some of Anna has already pointed out that this is a fact, they are generated, they are exerted out of a condition of neglect. And a neglect meaning that sometimes these artists, they feel like there is no, their activity, their presence in the city is not really addressed by local cultural policies. I'm still taking an urban scale here in for my insights. So what I am likely to conclude in this for this second point is that grassroots artistic organizations are useful to understand how sometimes in the cultural sectors, their role is to implement their own image of something that is alternative to something that some opportunities that they must find for themselves. So they strive, this type of artists, they strive for creating twofold opportunities for themselves. And why do I say twofold? It is because they happen to be at the same time citizens of the city, so recipients of the policies, but also actors in the cultural economy. And they strive to create room for opportunities in the two spheres. So it is not just the market sphere, it is not just the government sphere at hand. Here it is much more generalized as a need from this type of organizations. And they have to react based on some perception that they have of absence of policies that do not really address them and tackle them. So I have promised you that I would have made 2 points today, but also a third one. So let me just wrap up. I think that based on what I am at least doing, I would like to bring in this idea of how can we rethink, why is it important? Well, we have said it is important to rethink the role of institutions and the state in terms of intervention in the cultural sectors through cultural policies. And I would argue that cultural policies of tomorrow should recognize the importance of citizens. So it is not just what new role for the state, but it is also what new role for citizens, which we have been saying communities are increasingly important in this type of decision making. Why is that? First, because they are not just recipients, but they are active participants. Arjo stresses the importance of contribution, right? So they do not just receive, but they also produce. This is very much within the framework of the commons that I usually adopt in my theoretical investigations. But this is also important to do because we should recognize that citizens bring in, based on proximity, on their proximity to the resources that we need to govern, knowledge, meaning that they possibly know more than policymakers that sometimes may be far. And I know that this is a very stressed argument in economics, but there are ways, and I hope that there can be ways, and again, theory of governance, of commons, and perhaps polycentric governance might be helpful in doing justice to the voice that sometimes citizens can bring in on the table. That is new information and knowledge. Thank you very much. I give you my email as I saw that my profile on the assay platform is not very developed. So maybe you want to take that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'm glad with the third point that you made, because otherwise I would have asked you to see what the consequent cultural policies are, that you first have stressed that the public art is about a practice. You call it relational commons. That's your term that you introduced, but the idea that people relate to it. And as you make also clear, then people are not consumers, as we usually think of in economics, but are participants and contributors. And in a way that's also implied that whereas we have this notion of willingness to pay, but in this approach, and I think that Anna and Bronwyn would also underscore this, that there's a willingness to contribute. Like in indigenous culture, as Bronwyn's argument, that there's a willingness to participate and contribute in that, at least pay, be conscious and aware, as also important is that you made, Valeria, the importance of knowledge. But you also, just like Anna, made this grassroots bottom-up argument. That we have to be respectful, and also how important the sources of people wanting to participate, contribute, take initiative, as some of your examples also illustrate. So thanks very much for that, Valeria, and also bring in this case of public art, because I think that's very illuminating to have these cases in mind. So now let me turn to David. David, we have thrown a few concepts at you and everyone else about common practices, cultural values, the government as facilitator, the willingness to contribute. a sense of shared ownership, shared vision. And these are concepts that are, I'm just curious how you take them, because they are somewhat different from what economists usually talk about. Is that so? Or do you think, is there something, do you see some new possibilities here? Or do you think you come a long time, you have a long extended experience, or is this just old stuff and new content and new covers?
Well, look, I've been speaking as an economist, as we are. I see this really as extending the sense of what economics is about and what economic policy is about. And that's exactly what you're doing in your proposals about value-based policy. I don't think that throws away the fact that economic policy remains part of the government's intentions, because they have to manage the economy, and we can't get away from that. But what you're arguing for, and I would certainly support this, is and I think as cultural economists, we have to take all of this on board, and and that's what we do. We extend the notion of value to widen the sense of what's important to policy for policy purposes. So, I mean, look, it's hard to know where to start in commenting on some very interesting interventions, not just your own propositions, Arjo, but also the comments from the commentators, from the sort of participants in the panel. Just to sort of say very briefly, and I think all have talked about this notion of sharing and common purposes, a commons, if you like, however one sees it. And this, as we know, does move us away from the standard neoclassical, neoliberal model. It doesn't entirely, because that model does still allow for the possibility of altruism or public goods and so on. But I think it does shift the emphasis very strongly away from those sort of concerns about the neoliberal model, and places us into a new discourse, or a wider discourse. It's probably better to put it like that. And so, for example, I think, one of the things that Anna was saying about in the area of heritage, I mean, I think heritage is probably a very good example of where talking to the policymakers, as you said, first of all, they say, "What are you doing here? This is we don't understand what you're talking about." And I think that's a process which we have to go through of persuading policymakers that we're not just there to serve their purposes of cranking up the economy. We are there to sort of to try to make some shift in the values. And I think that was a very strong point that you made, I think, and it's a very useful one. If I can say in relation to what Bronwyn was saying, I mean, of course, that touches me very closely, as Arjo mentioned, because I've been working for the last 5 or 6 years now with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in remote areas, because we've been doing, with my colleague Katja Petitska, we've been doing a survey of artists, and in this process, of course, we have been deeply immersed in the cultural practices and the cultural worldviews of Aboriginal people. And it's an absolutely mind-changing, life-changing experience to do this, because it does raise that whole notion of what we understand culture to be, and the Aboriginal people have no sort of distinction between the various parts of life. It's all part of culture. It's all part of their relationship with the land. It's the stories which they tell, the dream times, the spirituality of the whole process. And it is very elemental. It takes us living in the 21st century and living in a sort of highly sophisticated environment like we do, to go back to that environment and to see the sort of elemental nature of just dealing with the fundamental things about what makes us human, what constitutes the sort of long tradition of human life. As Bronwyn said, it's the longest continuing cultural tradition anywhere in the world there, and that's we've got an awful lot to learn about it, and unfortunately, there's a lot of people in Australia who either don't learn or have failed to learn. And there's a long process yet of moving towards, as you mentioned, a treaty, which is something which we are all hoping will eventuate. But I think from the purpose of this discussion, the notion of cultural value, which is implicit in all of that, is absolutely fundamental. And I think it's something which is terrific to see the work that Bronwyn's doing to articulate that and to put it in the context of the wider sense in which we're looking at cultural value. The question of public art, which Valeria talked about, I mean, I think again that's a very nice example of interdependence between people, of sharing of the commons. And I like that notion that you have of and the way in which you're looking at it is terrific. I mean, the sense that here's art which is suddenly plonked down in the middle of the public space and people have to relate to it. And I do see that as being a very strong way in which policy, because a lot of this art has to be commissioned and supported by well, let's say the public authority, if you like. It doesn't have to be. I mean, there is some public art in the world which has been sponsored by private corporations and so on. But nevertheless, that's the notion that there is a public interest in this and that the public can engage with it. I was also interested to hear you say a few words about Venice. And so that's you know, I always quote Venice as being one of the best examples of a concentration of cultural capital anywhere in the world. And I remember the work that we did. There's some of us are still around who did a lot of work in Venice in the early 90s when there was a very strong interest in this in Ca' Foscari in the university there, and there it was the notion of Venice as a city of art, in which people could come and sort of absorb the whole sense of a city as an artwork in itself, if you like. That puts it rather crudely, but that's what it was. And in a way, public art in the sort of more restricted sense of objects which are placed in public squares or in parks and so on. These are much the same sort of thing. So I really like that very much. Look, let me just say a few things about what Arjo was saying to come now around full circle to the point of this discussion. I think there's no question that the sort of incorporation of the wider sense of what people really want, what sorts of things are important to them in their lives and so on, as an object of policy is undeniable. And it's also undeniable that policymakers on the whole have got this wrong. And there is much too much concentration on the sorts of things that don't necessarily want people. And I would say, for example, you know, you mentioned GDP. We all know that GDP is an impossible measure of human welfare, and yet we go on and on using it. I mean, there are plenty of other indicators of social well-being which could be incorporated into national policy making. But what do? We scuttle back to GDP, possibly only because we can measure it, partly, perhaps that's one of the reasons, perhaps because it's a sort of an apparently objective assessment of economic welfare. But we know it's not, and I can't understand why this does continue with all the criticism that's being made of GDP as an indicator of human welfare. Why this continues? I know some countries are starting to move away from this, but it's a long process. But to come to the sort of main point, I suppose that I just make 2 points really. First of all, I think that the question, in terms of policy. Okay, in terms of policy, how are we going to do what you're proposing? I don't think there's going to be a revolution and suddenly overnight we're going to be able to make policymakers suddenly change the entire direction of the ways in which they make policy to take on board the sorts of things we're talking about. I don't think that's going to happen. I think you know, we have to be realistic about these things and think about how can, you know, what are the specific areas of policy where cultural economists can actually make some contribution and actually change things. And I think that one area or one sort of, well, let me say, first of all, I think that the notion of the distinction in value between economic value and cultural value is one which we work on, which we know about, and which we really have a much bigger job yet to do to incorporate this into policy-making procedures. We've got the sort of theory sorted out. We've got the sort of concepts sorted out. We've even got, you know, to some extent, the measurements sorted out. We're able to sort of provide some reasonably sort of plausible assessments of cultural value, which we can put alongside economic value if we're looking at policy strategies. But we've got a long way to go before we can really sort of say that this has been taken on board into the policymaking machinery. So I think that that's one thing we can do. Another thing which I would say particularly strongly is the notion of institutions. I mean, institutions both in the sort of the large sense, the large public institutions which exist, the universities particularly, public broadcasting, museums, galleries, and so on, in the public cultural institutions. I think these are things which tend to be downplayed. And in fact, in the case of the universities, which have traditionally existed, as we know, as the sites where public discussion and debate about ideas happens and new ideas are formulated and so on, and they're taken seriously. And this is where science evolves from the work that goes on, the research that goes on in universities. This has all been undervalued to the point of dismissing the importance of universities in society now. And I think that's and I say that, I suppose, as an academic myself, and we all are, but that's not self-interest that says that. It's looking out at the whole nature of the public discourse at the moment, and universities are not being allowed to play, or maybe it's our own fault, I don't know, but certainly universities aren't playing the role that they should play in bringing calling governments to account, in providing the sort of alternative means for discussing things like cultural policy. So, and I think, you know, the other thing to talk about in this context is support for things like museums, libraries, archives, and the other great public institutions, and including public broadcasting. And I think this is something which we're fortunate in this country to have a public broadcasting system which acts in sort of opposition to the relentlessly commercial broadcasting interests, notably, particularly Rupert Murdoch and his sort of extent of his influence in the world. We do have a public broadcasting system that stands up for the public interest and objective and fearless sort of reporting in the media, and that's something which we value. Not all countries have that, and so I think those are the sorts of things which are important. I think that's probably all I need to say, and would rather leave it to you to keep on the discussion, Arjo. But I do sort of support what you're about, and I think the question that you really need to ask is how at the sort of grassroots level is this going to happen? How are we going to make it happen?
Yeah, thank you very much, David. I appreciate your wisdom as usual. Your comments are most sensible and most appreciated. I don't know how you do it, but whenever you give your comments, I notice with myself and others how important we find what your reflections are. So thanks very much. Let me take one point and then go to Anna, because there are lots of questions I notice, and we should address the important ones. But about this, I agree with you that the impact on culture policy, the way people think, comes slow. But at the same time, I think that you and I and all people here have a responsibility to think ahead. To understand what the issues are, and before practitioners sort of are able to make sense of it, that we already have developed ideas, proposals, and I think that the world is waiting for new ideas. For example, what I liked about Eleanor, the idea of care. That we need to take care of our common practice. You just brought up public broadcasting, an issue that's very much on my mind. That we need to take care of the public sphere. If we don't, things fall apart. People are divided and we lose each other. So we have to be caretakers in some way or another. And I think that we cultural economists also need to have a sort of caretaking attitude towards the important, to the cultural sphere, as we all argue here, because it adds to what I would call then the good life for everyone, in whatever state people are. And it's nice the way you guys, David and Bronwyn, talk about indigenous people. And that's also, I found that when I was in Melbourne, quite inspiring to experience what that life is about, and intrigued about that, because in some way that life is very rich in a way that sometimes Western life seems to lack that richness. But anyway, I like this sort of an idea of caretaking and the idea of these practices that we participate. But let's go to the questions, Anna. What's one you were going to look at them, and what do you want to?
There are several questions. Some are very complex, and I don't know whether to start from the first ones, which we replied. The one from Marcin about the subsidiarity principle, but both Valeria and me replied to that. So it's a matter of subsidiarity, but it's not enough. I mean, I did a research about that, and it's not enough to have decentralization. You need also the implementation. But then Marcin was talking about an experience in Poland, where it seems that they're really trying to make an experiment, let's say. They look at the names we attribute to priorities when referring to culture and heritage-oriented activities. And so there's a work in progress in Poland with national statistics, the Union of Polish Cities. I think it's very interesting because what Marcin suggested, it's also that sorry, it's too dense. It's semantics, but can update the mindset of both decision makers, statistic analysts, and finally, one who deliver the services to local communities. So it's this idea also of a shift, if I understood right, Marcin, sorry, but it's a long question, shift in the way of framing and naming things, which I think it's an important point that you make. There's another question from Ludmila, where she asked whether if I see the role of expert intermediaries in the shift, where I see the role of expert and intermediaries in the shift I mentioned. So if I can quickly answer, I know that sometimes when you talk, it's risky because then, you know, it seems you want to throw the water and the baby too. That's not what I meant. But probably, you know, in this shift, when you talk about a shared practice, I think expert would be part of this sharing experiences. So that for me, they're part of the communities. I don't see them as somebody who's separated from the community. I don't know if that answer. Bronwyn, there's a question from Trina. How do you see your reflections on value in connection to David Throsby's concept of culture value?
Okay, thanks. Okay, and that's a really good question, and I appreciate getting that one because it gives me the opportunity to acknowledge what a important contribution David has made to understanding this whole area of cultural value and how important his frameworks have been. Certainly in terms of thinking about the different dimensions of value, the different aspects in terms of aesthetic value, bequest value, educational value, all these are really important, and you can think of Indigenous culture and really across all those different value dimensions, there's examples where you can show how they apply. So it's certainly really relevant and I think useful to have that framework. One of the frustrations, I think, you know, from an Australian perspective, and I know that, you know, like we often sort of, you know, get asked to do economic impact studies of the benefits of art and culture. And it's really a narrow gauge that, you know, some of the policymakers, at least, you know, in tenders and everything that have been come my way, have been, you know, like sort of wanting to look at. You sort of encourage a deeper view of saying, look, you're not really capturing the full benefit if we just look at the, you know, the amount of, you know, jobs that have created and you know, that type of, you know, tangible benefit that comes from investing in the arts and culture. It's really these other aspects that really add the value so much. If you just focus on, these, metrics that you might want to, throw up and use to justify spending, it's really undervaluing the benefit comes. And I think that, sort of remains a bit of a challenge, at least in, parts of Australia.
Yeah, can I pick up on that, Bronwyn, because that also addressed the question of John O'Hagan,
Yes.
because he also asked a question about evidence. And I think that Bronwyn is quite right. And I have a paper with Lucy Petrova, who is, and Susanna Grasa, where we develop a notion of the quality evaluator. But I applied it also in my time as governorship. The important thing is that you first figure out what a culture policy is about. Then you need to identify the stakeholders and understand what's important to them. So people in the neighborhood, what is important in their lives. And that varies from neighborhood to neighborhood. So you really have to sort of chart the values of the people you are trying to get involved, participate, and so on. And the quality evaluator is trying to see, first of all, how closely experience connect with what people find important, but also most interestingly, that because of what the cultural policies or whatever event or intervention or whatever, whether values actually change. And so you can imagine that in your project, Bronwyn, that if people start appreciating indigenous culture more, change because of that, as I experienced it myself, and you guys too, apparently, David and you. David even talked about a life-changing experience. I'm curious what that means for him, but apparently certain values changed with David. And that means that it is not an economic impact, it's not a social impact, but it's a cultural impact. And cultural policy is about cultural impact, first of all. And the quality evaluator tries to bring it out. So John, that's what we are trying to do. There are still a lot of issues to be solved, but we are working hard on making an evaluator like that works, because foundations are really much in need of these sort of evaluators. Otherwise, as David also pointed out, we are measuring the wrong things. Number of visitors, number of people getting a job or whatever, which is not really what the cultural impact is about. It's more what David was referring to when he was telling about a life-changing experience. Anna.
Well, we don't have too much time, but I think I can there's one topic which was asked both by Carol, Trine, and Andrei. It relates to the relationship with policymakers. So Carol would suggest that we need, as culture economists, to really explain the benefits of the more advanced methods to policymakers. Trine suggests that actually policymakers are starting to get more interested in culture economics than 10 years ago. And she also suggests later that they're also starting to look not only at the economic impact, but also like a cultural impact. And also Andrei is a bit like reflecting whether, this aspect is more related to research or to the policy making. I hope, Andrei, that I summarize your question because it's very long. So I think this is for everybody on the floor, because I think we can have different perspective on this.
I might just start. I just want to make the point as well that I think some of the people involved in policymaker, like we just had the panel that featured some people from Singapore and obviously the Australia Council for the Arts, and like I think they get it. Sometimes I think it's more a problem with the politicians and some of the constraints that they place at that sort of higher level, that that is where more challenge lies.
Yeah, and let me add, I talk with policymakers quite a bit, and what I'm intrigued is that this notion of the good life is now being used. Politicians also talk about that. Our Prime Minister had a speech about the good life. So if that is sort of filtering in and becoming part of people's awareness, then they're more conducive, I think, and open to the talk about cultural values that we make here, and the idea of that people's life are enriched if they are able to participate and contribute to certain common practices, as we cultural practices, as we discuss here. I mean, having said that, I still think we have a long way to go before it is sort of becoming part of the whole instrumentarium. But I find that conceptually we see these shifts occurring. I mean, Trina also asked Anna a question to you that, and maybe you can answer that about that. That I made sort of a point that cultural economics doesn't have much of an impact, and she second guess me and think that that is changing, that the receptiveness is increasing. Maybe David has also an observation on that.
If I may, I agree with Trina. I mean, compared to when I started dealing with cultural policy, it's really like a million years ahead. I mean, things are changed. And I'm sorry, I hope I don't offend anybody, but if I think Italy, as Italy as an example, we are quite traditional. But recently there have been some changes, for instance, in the organization of the national museums, which have been really path-breaking for our way of thinking at culture. There's still a long way to go, but...
What kind of changes was that then, Anna?
Well, they got more independent. They got even, you know, some sort of autonomy in expenditure, which is really like the main issue. The procedures are so long that even if you have the money, you don't spend them. So there's also this issue in our research. What we found, at least in Sicily, was that even if organizations have the funds, they don't succeed in spending them because procedures are so long that then they are trapped in this kind of long process. And so from that point of view, I think there are changes taking place in my observation of policy in Italy, but also if I see, I mean, the Netherlands is always, I think, a bit faster in applying, you know, new tools, new intervention like adaptive reuse is now very, very hot in the Netherlands. So there are changes which are taking place, and I see policymakers, of course, adapting.
But are they talking in Italy also about public values? Because that's all the buzz right now here in the Netherlands. Everyone talks about public values.
Mostly with bottom-up initiatives. So you have special projects for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that we have 5 minutes left. So maybe what is interesting to see is that there were some comments from Dorota about what David said about universities. So she agreed that universities have not been really taken into account, but she also said that Horizon Europe could be, the new Horizon could be a way to do something differently. And Victoria agrees partially with Dorota, saying that maybe there's more space for universities. So I don't know, this is something that probably we all would like to tackle because it's really our Achilles ankle probably sometimes. I don't know, what do you think? And there's an interesting question from Valeria, but it's a long answer, and I saw that Valeria already agreed with Alice to discuss that online. So I'm checking.
Yeah. I also noticed a question about the involvement of artists. I thought that we talked about that, that artists are, of course, involved. And yeah, I don't know about you, but I think many of us talk a great deal with artists. I mean, I know, David, you do. You're married to one. And Valeria, you do too. And I think Bronwyn also. But we also think that and that's the whole idea of the practice, indeed involves artists not just as producers but as makers, and for a major part responsible for the quality of the practices. And that's what most artists do. I saw on paper that also uses your work preference model, David, about artists sort of preferring, of course, doing art even though they sacrifice in income and time and effort and so on, but because doing art is rewarding in and of itself, and it has something to do as being part of a common practice. I think that they feel relevant because of their participation. I think we have to conclude, Anna.
Yeah, I think so. I think so, and I'm answering to a question from Elisabetta, so.
Very good. Now, I would like to thank you all very much for your contributions, Bronwyn. Great that you, with all else you're doing, and David, so same. Thanks for your wise words, and Valeria, for your new impulses with public art, and Anna with your experiences on the whole issue of cultural heritage. Thank you very much, and who knows, it might have stimulated others who listened in and participated to continue this conversation. But now we're going ahead to a celebration.
Thank you, Arjo. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, you all.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Arjo.